Okay. All right, we're going to get started. Yes, you see everybody is muted. It's just going to be better this way so that we don't have any bounce back. So thank you all for joining us, and it's so nice to see our Beth, Jacob, and Momentum family. Hopefully soon we will all be together and we can do this in person. Memorial Day in America is a national shopping day, right? We look out for those Memorial Day sales. Since 9/11, Memorial Day has taken on a greater significance, right? Many have felt the loss of dear ones who perished on 9/11 and those lost in the battles that followed. However, it does not compare to YomHazikaron, Israel's Memorial Day, where tens of thousands, I read today that tens of thousands of people usually visit their loved ones' graves. The cemeteries are full. Everyone in Israel intimately knows of someone who was killed in battle or was a victim of terror. So to all the Israelis with us this evening and to all those who have served in the IDF, we thank you and we salute you. Before going into battle, the IDF soldiers are told to write letters to their dear ones in case something should happen to them. The video we're about to show gives us a sense of the pain and the loss that is felt by so many. It's followed by a video of the siren. For those of you who have been in Israel during YomHazikaron, you have felt that power of the moment, the power where everything stops, cars, buses, people walking. This year, the streets were empty as most were housebound, but we chose a video from a previous year so that you can experience the power of that moment.
אמא, אני אוהב אותך באמת, היית אמא הכי מדהימה בעולם, יותר ממה שאפשר לבקש. לא רציתי להדאיג אותך מהכניסה לעזה או משהו, בבקשה תהי חזקה בשבילי. ואם יקרה לי משהו, תחייכי בתאווה, אני אוהב אותך, אוהב אותך, אוהב אותך. אוהב אותך, אוהב אותך, אוהב אותך. אבא, היית ונפלא באמת. אבא, גבר, גבר. למרות שרק בחודש האחרון, אל תייחס לזה משמעות. אני אוהב אותך, אוהב אותך, אוהב אותך. אוהב אותך, אוהב אותך, אוהב אותך. אהבה תמיד. שחר שיר לי ולכל הקרובים והחברים, אני אוהב אתכם, אוהב אתכם, אוהב אתכם. אני אתגעגע אליכם ומקווה שלא תתגעגעו אליי, כי אני שמח שנפלה בחלקי זכות וכל למען המדינה שלי. אני אוהב אותה, אוהב אותה, אוהב אותה, אוהב אותה, אוהב אותה, אוהב אותה. אז אם אתם קוראים את המכתבים, כנראה שהלכתי לישון. לילה טוב, שון.
Israel somehow goes from YomHazikaron, from moments that we just experienced, into YomHaAztmaut, transitions into incredible happiness and rejoicing, exultation, singing, dancing, bopping, as we make that transition. And it really is an incredible transition, and it really is an incredible miracle. As I say so often, we are living the dream. We are literally living the dream. The dream of our grandparents, our great-grandparents, going back for generations, who would read and would say in the Shir HaMalach, B'shuv Hashem Eshiva Sion, Hayinu Kechomim, God will bring us back to Zion. We'll be like dreamers. They were living in the world of Jeremiah, of Eicha, of Lamentations, of Eicha Yashva Bedad, Ha'ir Rabati Am. How can she sit alone? This city that had been so filled with people, and now is so desolate. That was the world that they were living in, but they were hoping and praying and believing in the world that we live in. Incredible. Incredible. We live in the world that we travel to Israel, we visit Israel, we live in Israel, our children were born in Israel, that Israel is a part of our reality. Truly, truly incredible. To me, the most stark vision of this is at the liberation of Buchenwald. The youngest inmate there was 8 years old. He did not know how to read, did not know how to write. He was the scion of a family of rabbis, but he knew nothing about religious Judaism, about anything. And at that liberation, if someone would have leaned over and whispered in someone else's ear, you see that 8-year-old boy? He will become the chief rabbi of the state of Israel. Had someone said that, the response would have been Nebuch. How sad, how tragic. This person survived in body, but he's lost his mind. He's delusional. A state of Israel, a chief rabbi, this boy. But in fact, that 8-year-old boy was Rabbi Yisroel Meir Lau, who became the chief rabbi of Israel. And all of a sudden, the prophecies that they had only dreamed about, Od Yeshvu Zikenu Zikenos B'Rechovos Yerushalayim, there still will come a time where the older people will sit in the streets of Jerusalem. That's become a reality. Od Yishama Ba'are Yehuda V'Chutzos Yerushalayim will once again be heard in the cities of Judah, the streets of Jerusalem. Kol Sason V'Kol Simcha, Kol Chatan, the Kol Kala, the sounds of rejoicing, the sounds of grooms, the sounds of brides. That has become a reality. We have weddings in Israel.
You know, actually, I'm just thinking now that during this time where people can't get married in halls because of the coronavirus, people are getting married in the streets. The prophecy is so real. They're getting married. The Chatan and Kala are coming and getting married in the streets.
That's the dream that we live in. In Sha'amalot Hayinu Kechom, we'll be like dreamers when we return to Zion. We are living the dream. And in 1948, when all was hanging in balance, with that United Nations vote, and then with David Ben-Gurion's Declaration of Independence, actually it's called the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel, that is when this started to become a reality. It led to war, it led to bloodshed. We heard last week from Sam Silverberg how he was fighting in that battle and lost someone very dear to him in the battle of 1948. But David Ben-Gurion's declaration was a ringing cry of the history of the Jewish people, of the destiny of the Jewish people. And in this next video, we're going to hear his words from him in their entirety.
לפניכם את מגילת היסוד של מדינת ישראל, אשר אושרה בקריאה ראשונה על ידי מועצת העם. בארץ ישראל קם העם היהודי, בה עוצבה דמותו הרוחנית, הדתית והמדינית, בה חי חיי קוממיות ממלכתית, בה יצר נכסי תרבות לאומיים וכלל אנושיים, והוריש לעולם כולו את ספר הספרים הנצחי. לאחר שהוגלה העם מארצו בכוח הזרוע, שמר לה אמונים בכל ארצות פזוריו, ולא חדל מתפילה ומתקווה לשוב לארצו ולחדש בתוכה את חירותו המדינית. מתוך קשר היסטורי ומסורתי זה, חתרו היהודים בחובתו לשוב ולהיאחז במולדתם העתיקה, ובדורות האחרונים שבו לארצם בהמונים, וחלוצים, מעפילים ומגינים הפריחו נשמות, החיו שפתם העברית, בנו כפרים וערים, והקימו יישוב גדל והולך, השליט על משקו ותרבותו, שוחר שלום ומגן על עצמו, מביא ברכת הקדמה לכל תושבי הארץ ונושא נפשו לעצמאות ממלכתית.
תרנ"ז 1897 נתכנס הקונגרס הציוני לכל קריאתו של הוגה חזון המדינה היהודית תיאודור הרצל והכריז על זכות העם היהודי לתקומה לאומית בארצו. זכות זו הוכרה בהצהרת בלפור מיום ב' בנובמבר 1917 ויושרה במנדט מטעם חבר הלאומים, אשר נתן במיוחד תוקף בינלאומי לקשר ההיסטורי שבין העם היהודי לבין ארץ ישראל, ולזכות העם היהודי להקים מחדש את ביתו הלאומי. השואה שנתחוללה על עם ישראל בזמן האחרון, בה הוכרעו לטבח מיליונים יהודים באירופה, הוכיחה מחדש בעליל את ההכרח בפתרון בעיית העם היהודי מחוסר המולדת בעצמאות על ידי חידוש המדינה היהודית בארץ ישראל, אשר תפתח לרווחה את שערי המולדת לכל יהודי ותעניק לעם היהודי מעמד של אומה שוות זכויות לתוך משפחת העמים. שארית הפליטה שניצלה מהטבח הנאצי היום באירופה ויהודי ארצות אחרות לא חדלו להטיל לארץ ישראל עליו כל קושי ומניעה וסכנה, ולא פסקו לתבוע את זכותם לחיי כבוד, חירות ועמל ישרים במולדת עמם. במלחמת העולם השנייה תרם היישוב העברי בארץ את מלוא חלקו למאבק האומות השוחרות חירות ושלום נגד כוחות הרשע הנאצי, ובדם חייליו ובמאמצו המלחמתי קנה לו את הזכות להימנות עם העמים מייסדי ברית האומות המאוחדות. 29 בנובמבר 1947 קיבלה עצרת האומות המאוחדות החלטה המחייבת הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל. העצרת קבעה מאת תושבי ארץ ישראל לאחוז בעצמם בכל הצעדים הנדרשים מצדם הם לביצוע ההחלטה. הכרה זו של האומות המאוחדות בזכות העם היהודי להקים את מדינתו אינה ניתנת להפקעה. זוהי זכותו הטבעית של העם היהודי להיות ככל עם ועם עומד ברשות עצמו במדינתו הריבונית. לפיכך נתכנסנו אנו חברי מועצת העם, נציגי היישוב העברי והתנועה הציונית, ביום סיום המנדט הבריטי על ארץ ישראל. ובתוקף זכותנו הטבעית וההיסטורית, ועל יסוד החלטת עצרת האומות המאוחדות, אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל. אנו קובעים שהחל לרגע סיום המנדט הלילה אור ליום שבת בעשיית תש"ח 15 במאי 1948 1948. ועד להקמת השלטונות הנבחרים והסדירים של המדינה, בהתאם לחוקה שתיקבע על ידי האספה המכוננת הנבחרת, לא יאוחר מ-1 באוקטובר 1948. תפעל מועצת העם כמועצת מדינה זמנית, ומצד הביצוע שלה מנהלת העם יהווה את הממשלה הזמנית של המדינה היהודית, אשר תיקרא בשם ישראל. מדינת ישראל תהא פתוחה לעלייה יהודית ולקיבוץ גלויות. תשקוד על פיתוח הארץ לטובת כל תושביה. תהא מושתתת על יסודות החירות, הצדק והשלום לאור חזונם של נביאי ישראל. תקיים שוויון זכויות חברתי ומדיני גמור לכל אזרחיה, בלי הבדל דת וגזע ומין. תציע חופש דת, מצפון, חינוך, תרבות ולשון. תשמור על המקומות הקדושים של כל הדתות, ותהיה נאמנה לעקרונותיה של מגילת האומות המאוחדות. מדינת ישראל תהא מוכנה לשתף פעולה עם המוסדות והנציגים של האומות המאוחדות להגשמת החלטת העצרת יום 29 בנובמבר 1927, ותפעל להקמת האחדות הכלכלית של ארץ ישראל בשלמותה. אנו קוראים לאומות המאוחדות לתת יד לעם היהודי בבניין מדינתו ולקבל את מדינת ישראל לתוך משפחת עמים. אנו קוראים גם בתוך התקפת הדמים הנערכת עלינו לחדשים לבני העם הערבי תושבי מדינת ישראל לשמור על השלום וליטול חלקם בבניין המדינה על יסוד אזרחות מלאה ושווה ועל יסוד נציגות מתאימה בכל מוסדותיה הזמניים והקבועים. אנו מושיטים יד שלום ושכנות טובה לכל המדינות השכנות לימיהן, וקוראים להם לשיתוף פעולה לעזרה הדדית עם העם היהודי העצמאי בארצו. מדינת ישראל מוכנה לתרום חלקה במאמץ משותף לקדמת המזרח התיכון כולו. אנו קוראים אל העם היהודי בכל התפוצות להתלכד סביב היישוב בעלייה ובבניין ולעמוד לימינו במערכה הגדולה על הגשמת שאיפת הדורות לגאולת ישראל. מתוך ביטחון בצור ישראל הננו חותמים בחתימת ידינו לעדות על הכרזה הזו במושב מועצת המדינה הזמנית על אדמת המולדת, עיר תל אביב, היום הזה, ערב שבת, באייר תש"ח, 14 במאי 1948, לקבל את מגילת היסוד למדינת היהודים במידה. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהחיינו והגענו לזמן הזה.
בארץ ישראל קם העם היהודי. החלוצים מעפילים מגינים הפריחו נשמות. חיו שפתם העברית בנו כפרים וערים והקימו יישוב גדול. על אף כל קושי מניעה וסכנה הם לא פסקו לתבוע את זכותם בחיי כבוד חירות לעבר ישרים מולדת הארץ לפיך נתכנסנו ומפרידים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל היא מדינת ישראל. מדינת ישראל תהא פתוחה לעלייה. מושתתה על יסודות החירות, הצדק והשלום. שיח חופש דת מצפון, לשון חינוך ותרבות, לטובת כל תודה לפיך נתכנסנו ומפרידים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל היא מדינת ישראל. זו הטבעית של העם היהודי להיות ככל המדינה עומד ברשות עצמו. לפיך נתכנסנו ומפרידים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל היא מדינת ישראל.
Ben-Gurion's proclamation was meant to be private. People were not told what it was all about. But word quickly spread. And when they left that hall there in Tel Aviv, which we had visited not that long ago on our trip to Israel, there were thousands of people outside celebrating, rejoicing in this truly historic moment. And really it was a moment that went against history, that a nation in exile for 2,000 years, persecuted, trampled upon, had returned to their homeland. At that point, it was very clear we were David, and the Arab nations were the Goliath all around us. It's gotten more difficult. Israel's gotten very strong. And even though, according to the census that I read this morning, we have about 9 million people in Israel compared to hundreds of millions of Arabs around us, but Israel is viewed as the Goliath. And we have issues on college campuses, issues with the way the media represents things. And I wanted to share with you a video. It's almost funny. It's incredible. The chutzpah that went into the success, the victory in that war of independence. But it was this incredible chutzpah and what I view as incredible divine assistance to bring about this true miracle. Afterwards, we will all stand for the Hatikva. Then I'll just share one last thought with you. But this is a bit humorous, but an incredible view of Israel and the way that we won the war in 1948.
It's no secret. Israel is often synonymous with high-tech wizardry, and as a tiny nation about the size of New Jersey, it clearly punches above its weight class economically, scientifically, technologically, and militarily. But back during their fight for independence in 1948, the Israelis were underdogs in many ways. They were outgunned, facing multiple trained armies. Not a gambler in Vegas would have bet on the Jews. But what's important to know here is that what the Jews lacked in sheer power, they made up for in resourcefulness and creativity. To paraphrase Hamilton, just like their country, they were young, scrappy, and hungry. They managed to make use of things like the Davidka, a loud, inaccurate, and mostly ineffective weapon. They also spent their nights secretly building dirt roads and dropping soda bottles out of planes. That's right, soda bottles. Crappy weapons, dirt roads, and recycling. How does that help you win a war? You know the story of David and Goliath, right? Little, scrawny guy takes on the Hulk with nothing but a slingshot. Why the Bible lesson? Well, during the Arab-Israeli War in 1948, we had kind of a David and Goliath situation on our hands. The Jews, like I mentioned before, were a scrappy bunch. They had their underground militias, the Haganah and the Irgun, which later became a small official army of the new state of Israel. The Jewish forces then were made up, in large part, by people who had just survived the Holocaust only a few years earlier. Meanwhile, local Arabs were supported by the Arab Legion, Transjordan's well-equipped British-trained army. Now, what we're focusing on is the early portion of the Arab-Israeli War, before the Israelis had to fend off the armies of several surrounding Arab countries. Still, the situation was dire, with the Jews finding themselves outmatched against the professionally trained Arab Legion. The Jews fancied themselves the David to the Arabs' Goliath. So, they needed their slingshot. Instead, they got the Davidka, a weapon named, in part, after the biblical story. Modeled after a primitive Czech weapon, the Davidka looked pretty unimpressive, and almost harmless. Anyway, with something like the Davidka, looks can be kind of deceiving. But actually, with the Davidka, the look told pretty much the whole story. It was a 3-inch spigot mortar with low explosive power and unreliable accuracy. But it was loud. In fact, it detonated so thunderously that it created panic among Arab troops. Historians are still pretty unsure as to how much damage the Davidka actually caused, but its real value was scaring off the enemy. Now, only 6 Davidkas were made, but they played a crucial role in the early victories for the Israelis, particularly during one decisive battle in the mountaintop city of Tzfat, which had been home to a thriving Jewish community since the 1500s. With Jews and Arabs wrestling for control of Tzfat, particularly the citadel, an ancient crusader fortress and the city's highest point, Jewish fighters needed an edge. They turned to the Davidka. The Jewish fighters stationed Davidkas in the city's Jewish quarter and attempted to shell Arab positions. The blasts the Davidka produced caused the Arab troops and many Arab civilians to run for the hills. They evacuated the city, leading to a huge victory for the Israelis. The Arab troops were so terrified by the noise of the Davidka that rumors quickly swirled that the Jews were developing a new secret weapon. Some even thought the Jews had harnessed an ancient, dark, magical power with ties to the occult. I'm totally kidding. But some actually thought they were developing an atomic weapon. They weren't. Or were they? No, they actually weren't. Anyway, one key weapon the Israelis did possess was a makeshift air force. But don't get too excited. With the U.S. and British banning arms shipments to Israel, the young nation turned to Soviet bloc countries, desperate to make arms deals. So the Israelis ended up with a small fleet of poorly conditioned old Czech planes to halt the advances of Arab troops on Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. When Israeli volunteer pilots ran out of bombs, they didn't run out of ideas. They got creative and dropped seltzer bottles in lieu of artillery. That's right. As they fell, the bottles made a loud whistling noise that sounded something like bombs dropping. And the bottles also burst on impact and made one hell of an explosion. Again, much like the Davidka, the noise alone created the illusion of more firepower than the Jews actually had. But in the battle for Jerusalem, the 4,000-year-old city and Israel's future capital was under siege. And the Israelis appeared out of answers. In early 1948, Arab forces took control of key strategic vantage points overlooking the city. See, Jerusalem is situated on a plateau with mountains surrounding it. With Arab troops also blockading the main road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, it became increasingly difficult for the Jews to get arms and supplies into the city. Things as elementary as food and water. With their supply lines severed, the Jews of Jerusalem were in deep trouble. Panic set in. Food rationing was implemented. The allowance per person per day was set at 2 gallons of water for all bathing and drinking, and 3 slices of bread. Residents were on the verge of starvation. Again, against Goliath, they needed a miracle. A David, a hero. When you think of the heroes in Israel's fight for independence, you probably think of Ben Gurion and his crazy hair, Moshe Dayan and his eye patch, the locals. But it was actually an American who ended the siege of Jerusalem. Ever heard of Mickey Marcus? Well, Mickey Marcus was a bright, athletic kid who grew up in Manhattan on the Lower East Side with Jewish Romanian immigrant parents. A decorated West Point graduate, he fought for the U.S. in World War II and became an advisor to Presidents Roosevelt and Truman. In 1947, Ben Gurion turned to Marcus and asked him to find an American to advise the newly formed Israeli army. When he couldn't find anyone willing to take the job, he volunteered himself. The U.S. War Department allowed it, but under the condition that Marcus operate under a different name. In short order, Michael Stone, a slightly more intimidating name than Mickey Marcus, became the first general of the Israeli army. He instituted a U.S. Army-inspired structure and took control of the Jerusalem forces in the spring of 1948 to help end the siege. Initially, he attempted 2 failed operations against Arab Legion forces to reopen supply lines along the main road between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Then, he set out on a new path, literally. Rather than try to reopen the main supply line, he decided to build a brand new secret road that he called the Burma Road. Named after World War II supply route in China, the Burma Road to Jerusalem was built mostly in secret at night, in the dark, along the imposing rocky slopes of the Judean hills and under the watchful eyes of Arab Legion troops stationed in fortresses dotted along the route. Using hundreds of Jerusalem quarrymen, volunteers, soldiers, bulldozers, and a handful of donkeys, the Israelis constructed the makeshift road along a narrow footpath worn by centuries of shepherds filled with rocks, pits, and ravines. After 2 weeks, slow-moving supply vehicles were able to make the 6-hour trip. Arab snipers did gun down a small number of Israeli road workers once they spotted activity, but couldn't shell the supply vehicles because crucial parts of the road were cleverly built out of the line of sight of the enemy artillery. Eventually, convoys carried as much as 100 tons of cargo every night over the new Burma Road, effectively ending the siege in Jerusalem just before a United Nations truce in June of 1948. Now, the truce didn't actually end the war. It was only temporary because the war would go on for another 9 months. Unfortunately, General Mickey Marcus was tragically lost to friendly fire just before the truce. Moshe Dayan and others accompanied his body back to the United States for burial. But Marcus and the Burma Road, much like the Davidka, were memorialized. The Israelis' legendary resourcefulness was enough to merit a film adaptation, the 1966 Hollywood movie Cast a Giant Shadow, with stars like John Wayne, Frank Sinatra, Yul Brynner, and playing Mickey Marcus, Kirk Douglas, whose stage name was also slightly more intimidating than his real name, Isser Danielovich. Hollywood loves a good underdog story, and the story of the Israelis outsmarting the Arab Legion with loud noises, seltzer bottles, and by moonlighting as a construction crew delivers. But with all its successes and its modernity, is Israel still an underdog? A David? Well, when it was established, Israel certainly had the rooting interest of an underdog. Most of the international community, as evidenced by the pivotal 1947 UN vote, supported the Jews, still reeling from the Holocaust, having a nation in their ancestral homeland. But not Israel's neighbors. You see, Israel's ascension to a country known for high-tech mastery and military might isn't by accident. It's out of necessity. Israel is surrounded by countries whose views have always ranged from not thrilled with its existence to openly calling for its destruction, which has forced it to take on what some people might consider the role of Goliath. So, to be clear, Israel had widespread support when things looked bad, really bad, when they were relying on loud bangs and soda bottles to try and win a war. And now, well, I guess the question becomes this: is support for Israel contingent upon it being a classic underdog, an entity that's easy to root for because it's expected to lose? That seems like a viewpoint that's lacking nuance and context. This isn't a sport, it's not March Madness. After all, this is real life. Food for thought.
I just want to leave you with a thought that I heard from Rabbi Mati Berger of HaTorah. Someone calls his friend and says, I have an incredible investment. Put in $10,000. It's going to double tomorrow. This guy is conservative. Doubling in one day? No, he's not putting in the money. Doesn't go in. Next day he checks the paper. It doubled. His 10 would have been 20. His friend calls and said, did you read the paper? Do you see? He says, yeah, I did. Well, if you go in today, it's going to double again. The guy's too conservative. Doesn't go in. Checks the paper the next day. It's up to 40. His friend calls him, did you see the paper? Yes, I saw the paper. Go in, it's going to double again. I can't, I'm just too nervous. Next day, checks the paper. It's 80. Next day, it's 160. Next day, it's 320. The guy's too afraid to go in. Weeks later, his friend calls him and says, do you see what it's at? It's in the millions. And he says, yeah, I know. I put my 10K into a CD. Now it's worth $10,031.43. But the friend said to him, listen, you're a buddy of mine. I invested $10,000 for you along with my initial investment. You're sitting on a treasure. We are sitting on a treasure. It was invested in us by generations and generations and generations. By the people who gave up so much for the Jewish people. Those who gave up so much for the state of Israel. Those who made the ultimate sacrifices for the Jewish people, for the state of Israel. Every single one of us, we are sitting on a treasure that's been set aside for us. And now it's our turn. Now it's for us to cherish that, to embrace that, and to live that. We're living in miraculous times. Cherish, embrace, and live the incredible treasure that's been given to us. Natalie and I thank you all for joining us
so much.
This evening, and a special thanks
To
to
Shalom
Beth, our son-in-law, who
all the technical stuff.
kept things running smoothly when
And,
I would have tripped over the wire 5 times already.
And we thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you all soon, and we hope to meet in Israel in the near future.
Yes.
We should all return in the coming days and be together. So
Amen. Amen.
and HaAtzmaut Sameach. Just
and we will reconvene at our usual go-to meeting site this Friday night, as in every Friday night until we're back in person, at 6:30 for our Kabbalat Shabbat. Please come and join us. Also Lunch and Learn on Thursday. Please come and join us. Let's all stay connected. Let's all stay healthy. Let's stay safe. And like I said, cherish, embrace, and live the treasure that was put aside for us. Thank you so much. Good night.
Good night.
HaAtzmaut Sameach.